Hostility against the French in their former West African colonies has hit an all-time high. In Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, the pushback has been angry and noisy. Economic decline and instability linked to insurgents have characterized some of these countries, making them prone to military takeovers. To some critics, the policy of Francophone, which binds France to its former colonies economically, politically and militarily, means the French never really left Africa. For others, the French are just meddlesome. This week on the program, we explore the genesis of anti-French sentiment in Francophone West Africa and how it is playing out, its geopolitical context, the likely outcomes for the wider Sahel region, and what the future may hold for France-Africa relations. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, in July, Niger became the latest former French colony to be taken over in a coup, with the military junta blaming France for their current economic problems. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague Daniel Arap Moi takes a look at the deteriorating relations with France in the region.
France has already evacuated 600 of its nationals from Niger. Paris has also cut budgetary support to Niamey and backed efforts by the economic community of West African states to reverse the coup. Amidst the deteriorating relations, French President Emmanuel Macron has warned Paris will respond to any violence against its interest in Niger. France has always maintained strong political and diplomatic ties with Niger since 1960, when the West African country gained independence from Paris. The relations have been retained by Niger's previous civilian and military administrations. They have now been suspended by the new military-led government of General Abdourahmane Chiani. Under a security deal signed with Niger, France has a garrison hosting 1,500 troops in Niger, together with an Air Force base servicing fighter jets and attack drones. These troops are there to take part in the fight against militant groups in the Sahel region. Now, days after taking over, the Niger military-led government announced that it had revoked defense cooperation deals with France, undermining French efforts to combat terrorism in the Sahel region. The French Foreign Ministry in response said that the revocation of military pacts by the junta will have no effect on existing military deals since Paris does not recognize the junta. Niger is the world's seventh largest uranium producer, and France, which relies on nuclear energy for around 70% of its power, is a key importer. Niger has also been part of the CFA franc, a currency once pegged to the French franc and now to the euro. The currency provides Paris power over most of the former French colonies in West and Central Africa. Since gaining independence 60 years ago, French has remained the official language for the 25 million Nigerians and cultural organization within the Francophone group of nations. Daniel Arap Moi, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, joining me now to take a closer look at the rising anti-French sentiment in West Africa are Professor Joaf Toka, professor of the American Graduate School in Paris. From Abuja, David Otto Endele, director, Horn of Africa Institute for Peace and Security. And joining us from London, Paul Ejime, global affairs expert and ECOWAS consultant on peace and security communications. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'll start off with you, Professor Toka. There has been a flurry of activity from the international community following that coup in Niger. Why is Niger so important to the West and particularly to France?
Well, it is the number 5 or 6 or 9, if you wish, if you take another time frame, a coup d'etat, a putsch, over a relatively short period of time. And there is a feeling, at least in the West, in Europe, that that was the putsch, which was the one, which was just the too many one. Now this is but of a political and a psychological and mental sort of feeling, and it doesn't go all the way down to the roots of what politically and ideologically and militarily is the real picture in West Africa. But it is clear now, if we look at the map, that we have sort of a strip of about 5,600 kilometers all the way from the Atlantic Ocean towards the east, practically all the way to the Mediterranean, in which we have governments which are run by military rules, most of them because of a relatively recent coup d'etat, putsch. But the feeling right now is that this situation right now does not resemble the so-called ordinary putsch scenario, and actually poses real dangers not only to Niger, but to a whole list of countries around it, all over the Sahel.
So, David, let me get your view here. Is it really about too many coups in such a short time in Niger that France is so worried about?
The question now that a country like France seems to be more worried about is that, is this the last bastion? Is this the last military base that France will have in that particular region? They have been sent away from Mali. They don't have any roots at the moment in Burkina Faso. Now Niger, which was seen as the last base, is also falling. So I think what France now concerns itself about is that where does it go next, especially with the high level of anti-French sentiment, the high level of protest that France, has exploited these countries in the Sahel. So this is almost, like, for example, a situation where I think the French brand has become so toxic that, it doesn't have any roots to stand in any of these former colonies any longer. So that's the worry that France has at this point in time.
David, when you talk about exploitation, that France has been exploiting those countries in West Africa, what are you talking about?
If you look at what has been going on, people talk about, for example, in the case of Niger, where the French have about 15%, exploiting the uranium from there. There's talks about French imposition of the CFA currency and how it benefits from that. They talk about the legacies of Francafrique, which includes some old-time signatures, that were agreed upon, about paying reparations to these French colonies. So a lot of the current 21st century Africans who live in this part of the world, where French used to be the key colonial master, they are thinking they want a turn of the page. They want to have partnership, where they can have equal say. They want to move away from the old colonial legacy. And, perhaps, this is all the signs that we've seen. I mean, there is no justification for coup d'etats, but these are all signs of kind of resistance, to the existing and the continuous presence, of French domination in this part of the continent.
Paul, I want you to weigh in here and look at some of those historical issues like the CFA and how it's been closely linked to West African states and what France has actually been doing. Why does it seem that France has been so deeply involved in West African countries decades after independence?
It's a case of the cow that they are milking in Africa. It's not just West Africa. I think it's all the former most of the former French colonies. It's historical. They started with a policy of assimilation, making these people believe that they are French citizens while they are not. And then they came to association. Before they gave them independence, like David was saying, they made them sign up, their leaders sign up to very, disadvantageous treaties, like the fact that they would be depositing their resources in the French treasury. That's why you have the CFA for West Africa and Central Africa. And there, they now are made to borrow this money at market price. So how can you do that? You take somebody's money, because they actually exploit them, all the mineral resources. France is given the first point of refusal. If it's unless when France says they cannot do it, that is when you now give it to the other countries. And at the same time, you know, it is just they make them also buy defense or everything. They are dependent, actually. I call it flag independence for these countries. And it's been there. I think the people want to take back their country, the citizens, because they have seen that their leaders are in cahoots. They are conniving with French authorities to exploit them.
Right.
How can you imagine that in Niger that we are talking about, their uranium is a very prized mineral. They exploit that to power electricity for almost 60% of French citizens, while Nigerians are in darkness.
So, David, why has this relationship gone on in this manner, both economic and social, for so long?
Well, I think it's gone on for so long because, you know, there hasn't been any resistance, as we've seen in the current cases, be it through military coups, which, of course, you know, I cannot justify. But if you look at the reaction of the population, it tells you that perhaps, you know, now, as compared to 40, 50 years ago, there are now options. You know, the geopolitical space is shifting. There is no longer hegemony. Previously, the Western countries, for example, the US, the UK, and the rest of them, you know, will not go into spheres of influence. You know, if you've been given a particular colony, whatever business you do there, there is no interference. But what we've seen today is that this is shifting. You know, we have the likes of China, we have the likes of Russia, and other countries that, you know, are now delving into this space. And some of the people of these countries have seen that there is an option. If we leave France, you know, we perhaps, you know, might shift towards China because, you know, they don't interfere in the internal affairs of our country. We can shift towards Russia. They don't do the same. So there are options that people are now seeing in the continent and saying, well, you know, let's get away with France, you know, because, you know, we haven't benefited anything. Let's go with those that we can do business with. And simply, that is the reason why we're seeing all this uprising at this point in time. But also that Africans are becoming more independent. You know, they want to run their own affairs. They want to ensure that they had to take, you know, the faith into their hands. All this idea of, you know, colonial masters or colonial legacy, they are no longer interested in it. So they want to forge a new future ahead. And they're looking for partnership, one that develops the nation and one that sees them as equals.
Professor Toka, your voice here, I mean, is it, what's the reaction from France, first of all, to this anti-French sentiment on the continent? And secondly, is it is France worried about the geopolitical shift here, particularly from the Francophone countries?
Well, because if you look at the present situation and the explosiveness of all the ingredients, look at the map. You look at the map, you go all over Niger's borders, wherever you try to touch, you see a set of accumulated problems. Because wherever you touch over there, you're into more and more dangers with more and more delicatessen elements, and you may actually aggravate the situation rather than resolve it, regardless of what an eventual potential military intervention on the part of ECOWAS or others may actually mean in terms of the possibilities to operate in Niamey and all over the Niger territory. So things may get worse, and they are sufficiently dangerous as they are today.
So, Paul, you know, Niger has terminated military agreements and protocols signed with France and also announced the end of functions for Niger's ambassadors to France and the United States. An interesting perspective there from Professor Toka on the geopolitics involved and what may happen. What's your view here? What next? What happens? What is your thoughts about these drastic measures?
Well, as for the measures, I think they are knee-jerk. I mean, it's a case of precipitate decisions. You can't, the way they are going, the junta they are going about it might not be the best way. But one cannot justify military coup. But the point is that the blame lies squarely on the African leadership and lack of it. They are the ones, because it's about national interest, which is driving what the intervention of these other people. Prof says is for good reason. Good reason for France, for America. These two countries, they have military bases in Niger, and it's for their own strategic national interests that they are pursuing. Why can't Africans on their own do something? Because when you see them, even when they are also saying no to France, one leader will invite about 50 or so African countries leaders, and they all go there. It's not how to pursue leadership, development or assert your independence. But the point is that they have failed. African leaders have failed, and the population now see them as allies and partners of the West and America that are exploiting them.
Right.
But the military are only coming to, as opportunists. That is what I see. They are looking, the population, they are looking for alternative. So that is why the military seems to be, they're not the messiah, because you have seen what military rule can also do. Africa is not zero poor.
Right.
Africa can take care of itself, but African leaders have failed, unfortunately.
All right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment, but we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll continue with our conversation on the growing anti-French sentiment in West Africa. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor Joaf Toka, David Oto-Endele, and Paul Ejime. Before the break, we looked at the genesis of anti-French sentiment in Francophone West Africa, how it's playing out and its geopolitical context. Let's now look at the likely outcomes of the French backlash for the Sahel region and what the future may hold for French-Africa relations. David, since 1990, 78% of the 27 coups in sub-Saharan Africa have occurred in Francophone states. Many are now questioning whether France or the legacy of French colonialism is to blame for this. Is it?
Well, as my colleagues, my co-panelists have said, the French system of assimilation, has been a disaster to the continent. The French made most of the former colonies to believe that they were part of France, that they were French citoyens or citizens. But in fact, in comparison, to the West English-speaking African, countries, you would realize that countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, these are some of the poorest of the countries in that part of the continent. And it tells you that, the French, have not done any, justice, to this continent. And this is why we're continuously seeing that, there are anti-French sentiment. Most of these coups d'etats, were being linked to the French. There were so many assassinations, of some of these leaders in previous that were all linked to the French. So right now, we're just seeing more or less a resistance, a backlash, to the French policy, a backlash to the French presence, in terms of, their economic exploitations in the continent. And I don't see how the French are going to bounce back from this. Their brand has become so toxic that it is now affecting other Western countries. For example, the United States presence in Niger. I mean, if I were advising them, I'll tell them to run away very fast, from the French. Their colonies are in chaos, and this is all down to the policies that the French have implemented in the region, and also the economic exploitation. It's bad time for the French, and I hope that they do find some recovery, when they perhaps, get back on the drawing table.
So, Professor Toka, the French policies in Africa may not have worked. Actually, Niger is ranked, according to the Human Development Index, at number 189 of 189 countries. How does this sit, though, with France? How does France view its continued role in West Africa?
The question is, through French perspective, is actually to find once for all the right recipe. After, to a large extent, having failed in finding such an appropriate recipe for almost 2 or 3 generations. How do you preserve your influence? How do you try to protect as much as possible your economic interests? Do not seem to be intervening, do not seem to come back to those elements which are so sensitive and understandingly so in terms of the ex-colonial power raises its voice once again. And how do you integrate all that in the larger framework of a European and a Western policy? This is indeed a very challenging recipe to find, and actually the French cannot succeed in finding it. This is actually the bottom line. Now, when we come to the present immediate situation, the punctual situation on the terrain right now, I think that French leadership is absolutely convinced that the last thing it should seek to see is one way or the other of a military intervention, which would be directly or indirectly attributed to French initiative. I can see very little chances for the French to at least to seem to be neutral or away from the action. Don't forget that there are 1,500 French soldiers and 1,000 American soldiers. The French soldiers, reminding us all, are based in the airport in Niamey, namely in the #1 strategic point over the entire Nigerian territory. So how would any action from outside be absolutely dissociated from any French logistical or other help? So things are mined and trapped from all over the directions. And this is, of course, that everybody hopes in Paris and elsewhere there will be no decision regarding military intervention by anyone.
So, Paul, can the French bounce back from this, really? Because as we speak now, Chad remains the only standing base for France in that region.
So I think they can. But let me illustrate it with this. You have somebody who has there's a jar, and then that can pass your hand into the jar, and then you have an apple in that jar. And then it's such a way that your hands can go in and out freely. But if you now decide to hold that apple to bring it out, you are not going to have it. So the French should learn how to let go. President Macron talks about it, about review, another phase of relationship, but they are not doing it. Because how can you say that? And at the same time, do you know that the ECO, is what ECOWAS was trying to adopt. Now, France and President Ouattara went home after an ECOWAS summit and said that they were now going to hijack that name, ECO, to replace CFA France. But the replacement is only in name, not France. Paris will still, the wealth of former colonies will still be housed in Paris. So in the French treasury, and they are giving them as loan to these people. It is not about them, it is about France, the French interest. That is what is driving everything. Let African interests also compete and make sure that whatever resources is at home is used to develop Mother Africa, and not for cronies, and not for France or any other. It goes for not just France, let's face it. It goes for all other relations with every other foreign powers.
All right. I want to take your final comment here. And let me start off with you, Professor Toka. What next for the French in West Africa, and what next for Niger, in your view?
Immediate next is to try to find a solution to the punctual immediate situation with its several ingredients which are all explosive. Let it be through the direct situation regarding the situation in Niamey and Niger, but also all the affiliated issues, starting with the continuous fight against jihadist groups, the immigration issues, which to large extent also depend on the situation in Niger. So There is no easy solution, and there is no one or two component solution. There should be a lot of goodwill from a lot of partners here, and right now it doesn't seem extremely optimistic.
All right, Paul, your thoughts?
There is what I call, the immediate, mid-term and then long-term. For the immediate, I think everybody, they have seen that they burnt their hands, both the French and their allies, because if the diplomatic sources are saying that the former president of Niger, Mamadou Issoufou, probably knows about this, or it's an allegation that because the man who took over, by the way, Chiani, used to be his own head of his guard. He is also head of Bazoum's guard. I think Bazoum had overplayed his hand and then forgetting his sidelining his godfather. What is not clear is why you will have French troops there and American troops, and they didn't. The antenna did not catch, the intel did not catch these two coming. Whether it's how it blindsided them, or they wanted Bazoum to be sacrificed before they get another crony that will be singing their song. So it's complex and complicated. But the first thing to do, it is not by military intervention. Let them talk things out. Maybe there could be a 6 months or whatever transition period, but not a military intervention to get things cooled down. Then everybody will sit down. ECOWAS itself should also look at the way it is conducting its affairs. You don't jump with your two legs into this kind of fight for prosy. So France, please leave Africans to develop themselves. Africans, take charge of your destiny.
All right. David, you have the final word. What next for the French in West Africa, and what next for Niger?
Well, I think the French, they find themselves at the edge of a cliff, at this point in time, and any steps forward is not going to be determined as progress. In terms of what is going to happen to Niger, ECOWAS, must be very strategic in terms of what kind of decisions it takes. It has made the situation worse, by the 7 days ultimatum, which it cannot now, meet up with in terms of what it planned to do. I think what ECOWAS now needs to do is to try and find an amiable solution, a dialogue, with the Nigerian junta. They've made themselves, consolidated their power by bringing together the population in Niamey. They have brought together some of the sister agencies. They've appointed new governors, and they've also gained the support of regional partners. So what I think now should be done is that, the pressure should always be on making sure that the Nigerian junta, puts forward a transitional government. Maybe, and just maybe, they could have a discussion, I'm not sure how that's going to work, where President Bazoum, who has been dethroned, could have a chance, to run for the next, democratic system. But at this point in time, no military intervention will resolve the problem. It will be a disaster, to the continent. It will be a disaster to the region, and it will not serve the interest or the mission that anyone wants to achieve.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights in France and Niger, and on that coup in Niger. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests: Joaf Toka, Professor, American Graduate School in Paris; David Otto Endele, Director, Horn of Africa Institute for Peace and Security; and Paul Ejime, Global Affairs Expert and ECOWAS Consultant on Peace and Security Communications. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep this conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's bye-bye.